Okay, so, we spend so much of our time in our physics education thinking about systems that evolve according to conservative forces, that the kind of connection that we've built here, where, we've separated out the evaluation of all forces into, well, first evaluate some secondary structure to find sets of neighbors, and then evaluate forces between those neighbors, but where the way we built the neighbor list is just based on whatever force field we happen to be thinking about. That feels so natural that sometimes we forget that in modeling specific systems, that could be a real and important assumption, and one that we should pause and question, as especially we start thinking about, the crazy world of active, living, and other soft matter systems, right? So, to give an example, when we start going through some of the case studies for this chapter, we're going to think about classic models of flocking birds, right? And as we'll see in that model, birds try to, the degrees of freedom we associate with birds, basically try to align with whatever their neighbors are, right? But is it clear that the way birds choose who their neighbors are is really kind of the same as whatever sets their interactions in terms of how much they will try to align, right? Let's just pull up a video just for inspiration. Ultimately, we want to be thinking about how crazy collective behavior in flocks of birds like this can arise from, relatively simple, very coarse-grained models. And, things like how one bird aligns with its neighbors or how they choose who their neighbors are really things that we should be spending some time thinking about. As a quick aside, I found this video just by Googling, starling flock video, and it's on a channel called How to Survive. Let me just point out that if you find yourself near a flock of starlings, you're going to survive. So don't worry about that. Okay. So in living systems, I think this idea that we need to think seriously about the assumptions when we build our simple models, the assumptions that we make in terms of what are the interactions and what are the complete set of interaction rules. I think that's going to be an interesting area of research in the next little bit. And I think it's kind of natural that it comes up in complex systems like birds, right? Or other organisms. We've got brains deciding how they interact with the environment. And so I think, of course, any, coarse-grained model that treats entire neural networks as, simple force laws might have to think seriously about generalizing those force laws beyond the kind of, simple, pairwise, conservative potentials that we're used to thinking about in physics. Another case study that we'll be thinking about a little bit concerns collections of dense cells. Collections of dense cells. So, for instance, here is some experimental data. I should say this is from John Devaney, and who's a graduate student working with Margaret Gardell at the University of Chicago. What you're looking at here is a cross-sectional view through a monolayer of very dense epithelial cells, right? And you can see that these cells are basically occupying 100% of the available area on the flat substrate that they're growing on, right? And if we watch, how do these cells exert forces on each other, and how would we imagine writing down something in the spirit of like a molecular dynamics sort of model, right? Where, maybe these cells, we take some kind of simple degree of freedom to reflect their positions or their shapes. surely these cells can exert forces both on the substrate they're sitting on and also on each other. But it seems equally obvious that cells aren't choosing what cells they're interacting with just based on how far away one cell is from another, right? And instead, you might say, well, really what's going on is cells are choosing neighbors based on, does this cell share an edge with that cell or not? In a way, it's kind of like saying, regardless of distance, there's just going to be like a graph that I can use to say, oh, if this cell and this cell, share an edge, then they form an interaction pair. And if this cell and this cell share an edge, they form an interaction pair. So if I draw little shapes of cells or something, you start drawing interaction networks that are just based on, do I cross edges from one cell center to another, right? And what are the implications of choosing that kind of graph-based set of neighbor relations, or you might say a topological rather than a strictly metric set of neighbor relations, when we think about the collective behavior of these systems? Here's another paper taken from a Nature Materials paper by Malin Verno and collaborators, where you can see, just fascinating collective dynamics. And it's maybe worth thinking and asking yourself, is something about the qualitative nature of these collective dynamics influenced not just by the details of, well, what are the force laws here, but by the very qualitative difference from modeling of soft spheres or Lennard-Jones particles in saying, here, neighbor relations are much more graph-like than they are distance-like. Okay. So what I want to do in the next few sections is think about this generalization. What is the distinction between building, let's say, metric neighbor lists, where you might say, if the distance from I to j is less than some threshold, they're a neighbor, versus maybe topological neighbor lists, where, if I and j are connected by an edge in some graph, where, the rules for how we build the graph, how we decide in this kind of non-metric version of things, what things are actually neighbors of what, that's something that we have some, many different potential choices, many different potential models, and we'll discuss a few of those in the next section.